kiss for you.
All right, let's talk about Windows 10 and if it was successful or not. Real quick, I do think it was successful, and as this is out of context, we're trying to determine in a context situation if I handed someone Windows 10 without prior knowledge, let's say they came from Windows 8 or Mac OS, older versions of Windows 7, something like that, would they be able to pick up and use Windows 10, and would they be impressed? I would actually say yes, and we'll get into it here, but if that's all you're interested in, then there you go. I do think it was a success, and I do think it works out of context. Now, obviously, in order to understand this, there's a couple things we gotta go through. First off is understanding the timeline and where we are. Windows 10 launched in July 2015, which is about mid-2015. It's important to understand that it came from a pretty botched Windows 8 experience that was mostly mobile-focused and quite a bit different than Windows 7. It removed a lot of the features that people liked about Windows in general and replaced it with a mobile function that didn't work that well, and overall it wasn't a very liked operating system. And then we compared to Windows 10 that brought back a lot of those things. Now obviously Windows went through a lot of changes in that time. Obviously having an operating system around for about 7 years will do that. And as you can see from this point, right, Windows 11 was in 2021, so it was about 6 years, but ultimately Windows 10 is a success because it is a sequel to and precedes the disaster that was Windows 8. I don't think Windows 10 would have been as successful if Windows 8 wasn't as much of a departure, but because you kind of went back to what Windows was in Windows 10 from Windows 7, I do think ultimately that Windows 10 is a success. We got the timeline down. Let's really now talk about where that timeline leads us. Obviously, Windows goes through a bunch of updates during this time, about 14 of them, as you can see here from the Wikipedia page, and a lot of these updates do pretty major things, right? Originally, there was no ability to kind of click on the Windows button here and have a thing pop up. They fixed that pretty early on. There was obviously some improvements to things while updating, as well as anniversary updates, including stuff like better paint functionality. Universal Windows platform apps is definitely a pretty big thing they introduced here. Basically having a universal layer for apps that would work on Windows. This was kind of Windows 10's big thing, whereas that, hey, we know you don't like everything that happened with Windows 8 over here with all this mobile stuff, but we still want to provide that mobile experience if you want to, because touchscreens are still pretty big and people like touchscreens and are still using touchscreens. We don't want to completely abandon that. And so what they end up doing is a universal Windows platform that kind of combines some of that mobile first design language as well as compatibility with the more desktop and PC focused Windows 10 experience. And I think, generally speaking, they did a decent job with this kind of architecture here, right? This is a similar architecture that lets you use, Windows with touchscreen. It's what has a bunch of applications running. It has, for example, like what Task Manager and stuff. It basically just lets a translation between, maybe let's say I tap the performance thing versus I click on it, right? The reason that's important is because macOS doesn't have a touchscreen, so it doesn't have to kind of deal with the functionality concerns that a touchscreen or a stylus or anything like that might have. And so they introduced that. They talk a lot about Windows Defender. They're, built an antivirus thing. They have Windows Subsystem for Linux, kind of bridging the gap between the sort of quality of life features that Linux has and Unix-based systems have in general. A lot of the Windows things in terms of developer updates and frameworks and all that don't work on Windows. You have to kind of basically go into a PowerShell and, basically set up a whole new thing instead of just being part of the operating system. So they started, working with Linux and kind of making a subsystem there. And so overall, you look at the kind of things that they end up doing. They introduced Secure Boot for new installations as well as extended certifications and all that. And you really start to see how, okay, now they introduced VR compatibility. They introduced game barring controls. They introduced more privacy features. The snooze ability for updates were introduced later on, right? So obviously Windows 10 was not starting as a great thing, but it was good enough that a decent amount of people, if they were able to, kind of upgrade it. I don't believe from Windows 8. I want to say Windows 8 to Windows 10 was a free upgrade and 7 to 10 wasn't, but it could be a little bit, iffy on that. I'm pretty sure 8 to 10 was a free upgrade, and if you had a 7 to 10, you had to pay for it, but I'm not 100% sure. I was also using a lot of school computers and laptops at this time, so it is also possible that that was kind of built into it. instead. But it is just kind of interesting to go through the list here and see, okay, what stuff was base Windows 10? You realize not a lot. A lot of these features, like Windows Defender and Subsystem and the Creators Update and stuff, adding ability to like, media creation tools and all that, kind of got added on later. But I overall think because of their willingness to update Windows at a pretty decent pace here, you end up getting something that is very good over time. It's something that people really like over time because they keep somewhat, mostly providing very good updates for the system, right? Obviously, talking about drag and drop was a big thing, and the reason I mention this is because you have Windows 8, and a bunch of people are on Windows 8. And so what happens is you have to get people from Windows 8 and from Windows 7 to move over. And one thing you can do is make it more like the competitor at the time, Mac OS, that had a lot of drag and drop functionality. As I talked about before, the universal applications, bridging that mobile and PC gap, you get things like better drag and drop, better visual feedback, and functional feedback for that. And so that kind of really lets you sort of bridge that gap and get people over to Windows 10 when they might not have been. In comparison to something like Windows 11, if you saw my Windows 11 review, which we can just go to real quick, if you saw my Windows 11 review, you would know that I did quite enjoy Windows 11. I thought it was good. I didn't have any problems with it, but a lot of people were not that happy that I didn't have any problems with it because they expected me to have way more problems than I ended up having, right? I did overall recommend Windows 11. To me, a major part of that, and kind of the last thing I want to talk about here, is from an out-of-context perspective, from someone that, let's say, was at Windows 7, was at Mac OS, was, of all these things, like, what was the Mac OS in 2017? I believe it was High Sierra, yeah. So we're still back in the old kind of design language there. But one thing that was pretty prevalent at this time for Mac OS, and was very prevalent at this time for like Windows, specifically Windows 8 and even Windows 7 to some extent, was the amount of bloat that those systems kind of gathered over time, being compatible with everything. Windows 10, if you weren't aware, was on like a bunch of things. It was on like parking tickets, and it was on like point of sale systems for restaurants. Windows 10 was on like everything you could possibly imagine. And because it needed to work all the time for a bunch of different things, you couldn't basically stop Windows from just adding a bunch of crap you didn't want. It had a bunch of things in the background that was always going to be running, and it never ultimately kind of got to a point where they could get rid of some stuff, right? Because when you get rid of things and you don't end up using a lot of the functionality, it starts bogging down the system, making it slower, all that. So a lot of people's kind of perception of Windows at this point, no matter what it was it was a bloated operating system that needed cleansing. Windows 11, for a lot of people, myself included, felt like it got rid of a lot of that, which I do appreciate. One thing I will say, however, is that when you go through this and you determine all these additional features and stuff, and you don't end up kind of getting bogged down by that, I do think having multiple options for these things does really improve the experience. Windows 8 was a mobile-first platform, as we've talked about. And mobile-first platforms are very simplified because they're intended to be used by a wider audience. Someone that might not be proficient in using a mouse and keyboard, and someone that might be more used to iPads or other tablets. And so having a backend that works well is important. Windows 10 did that. Windows 10 basically said, okay, let's give you a backend. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. Let's give you a backend here. In this case, the start menu, the control panel, all this stuff, the old settings, the new settings, a lot of things were basically doubled up. But what that let you do is, hey, if you want to use the new mobile version, mobile feeling version of like weather, for example, you have that. But if you want to do the old version, you have that too. I think you can see that in something like Groove Music, right? Groove Music was Windows' kind of default player for Windows 10 that was more advanced, but they also had the old media player, Windows Media Player, that you could use instead. And so you'd have those two systems, this one obviously being more designed around the kind of mobile and touch focus with their whatever design language this is. And then you have the music player, Windows Media Player, that is much more archaic, but it can maybe do more things, right? Groove Music for a lot couldn't support a bunch of different file types and all that, and was pretty limited in functionality, but it was there and it was more compatible with Windows 10 as well as like Surface laptops and anything like that. Media Player wasn't as compatible. So while I do think a lot of that bloat is annoying, it is useful to have two versions installed, right? One that works for modern systems and one that works for, maybe older ones or older systems or people that want to deal with the new stuff. So I do think part of Windows' success was ultimately a double-edged sword. It's, hey, let's have a lot of options. Let's have multiple different music players, multiple different extensions, and multiple different like paint programs and movie maker studio, all that stuff. Let's have a lot of different options so that if you're coming from Windows 7, you're going to feel at home, and if you're coming from Windows 8, you're going to feel at home. And so, well, for me personally, I don't like that because I like having, one thing here. I do understand that a lot of people do like having multiple options and not feeling forced into one thing or the other. So I do think that, ultimately at this point, Windows 10's success came from the transition from Windows 8 to Windows 10, the improvements that they made overall to Windows 10, and the fact that they had backups just in case that ultimately, people transition effectively, going from a Windows 10 experience or Windows 8 experience that's very mobile focused to a Windows 10 experience, and then 11 that's a lot more PC focused. I do think that helps kind of bridge that gap, because unlike Apple that has iPads that were able to kind of help transition people to becoming more not dependent. I kind of talked about this before, but like the whole school system and how that relates for iPads and then eventually transferring to Chromebooks, like that kind of thing. Apple had that lock there, and Microsoft didn't really have anything, right? They had Surface, but Surface really wasn't a big thing. It was Windows 8 that kind of tried to compete there. But I think being able to transition someone from Windows 8 to Windows 10 and then to 11 was a good thing. And part of that's obviously, dealing with bloat and dealing with things that you might not like, but it's there to help people transition. So I do think an ultimate success of Windows was that transition with that, bloat, that basically the sacrifice you need to make in order to get dominant market share. And I think that's also important. Windows 10 was dominant and is still the dominant platform. Windows 11, due to its new system requirements, and even just the fact that for a start, you couldn't have Task Manager. It wasn't at the bottom here. You had to go and type it in, all that. And search is still awful and worse than it usually is. Like, there's a lot of things that you can talk about with Windows 11 that people don't like, right? Forcing Copilot down your throat and all that. Having much more ads and the weather thing, all these things being ads and ads at the top. And it gets annoying, but I do think, if you compare it, I think Windows 11 is another step in that direction of, you can get rid of the bloat now. You can get rid of some of that. For example, the File Explorer. This is much more of a sort of Mac OS style file explorer. You don't have all these weird, like, Word style, Windows 7 odd kind of things popping up. You have a much more simplified cut, paste, extra systems rather than that, like, crazy thing you had before. And so I do like this, and I like kind of more that attempt to make this feel a little bit more cohesive, right? Because obviously Windows 10 wasn't as cohesive. But all that to basically say, I do think Windows 10 was a success, and it's also important to note that, as I said before, this is coming to an end. You are going to, I think I can pop it up here. Yeah, this is ending 2022. This ends in 2025, like October, right? So a 3-year for this last end here for Windows 10, and you're going to be forced to move on to Windows 11 if you want to have security updates and patches and everything like that, right? So in talking about this, I do want to mention that, yes, Windows 10 is a success, but, try Windows 11. It's not the worst thing. It's pretty good in a lot of aspects, and I think, if you check my review and you like it and all that, then that'd be great. There is benefits in progress. There is benefits in kind of shedding a lot of that bloat and all these updates and all these things that are happening that can kind of bring into a better version of Windows, and if you don't accept that, then, it's almost like stifling progress in a way. Like, I understand a lot of people don't like Windows 11, but at some point you're going to have to accept that you need to, make or try and make Windows 11 better by talking about it. If we just ignore it and say, oh, it sucks, and, we ignore the problem, then you're ignoring the problem. You're not helping out. You're not trying to be productive and being constructive with the criticisms you have about it. You're just being in your own shell, right? And so I think if you try Windows 11 and there's a problem with it, open a support ticket, get feedback there, because I think overall, when Windows 10 ends, you are going to see a lot of people transition over. So hopefully it was an interesting discussion. Leave your opinions down below if you like Windows 8 more, if you, had problems with Windows 10, if you were like, oh, thank God Windows 10's still here, all that, leave it down there. Maybe you have a different opinion, and it's great. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the support on the recent videos. It's meaning a lot, and I'll see everyone in the next video.